Well. So, you might find it interesting to know that one of my favorite adaptations is from Persona 4. No, not that adaptation. This one, Persona 4 Golden, the animation. It's an adaptation of Persona 4 Golden, which was a PS Vita remake that was then ported over to the PC, and the show largely focuses on the new parts brought in by Persona 4 Golden, mainly the stuff revolving around Marie and a lot of the daily stuff that you can now do in Inaba. Yet, despite being clear in that it's adapting a game that's a remake, the show attempts to set up a general beginning, middle, and end. Narukami shows up, they kind of speed through a whole bunch of stuff, they go through Marie's character arc, and the show kind of ends. And that's kind of just that. The case of Persona 4 Golden, the animation, is pretty straightforward. It's an adaptation of a remake for an audience that's very clearly already supposed to be familiar with it. You're not really supposed to come into these insider jokes understanding exactly why they're funny on their own. You're supposed to be playing the game, right? But what if you already have? See, Persona 4 Golden, the animation, runs just like a normal story, but much of its narrative and emotional punch demands that you understand why it's important. You don't really spend as much time with Marie or the gang as you would in the game. And the story it presents is obviously not what it's entirely about. It's a text that, in really loose language, assumes you already know what it's going to deliver. In this sense, Persona 4 Golden, the animation, isn't a story that's completely contained, that you can get a sense of what it's trying to do just from what it gives you, because it doesn't even spend that much time on the mystery. It leverages another piece of media for its emotional connection. And this is really interesting. We oftentimes think of stories like they're self-contained, that we can read them from front to back and boom, we're done. But think about this. What if stories aren't necessarily standalone pieces, but more so they're a different kind of piece, pieces of a puzzle, and in this puzzle we can sort of peer into a world with some fascinating consequences. But I'm starting to think that I'm not necessarily the right person for this, so let me get somebody who is. Hey Mark, how's it going?
Hi Joe.
So, let's start and talk about your books here. Actually, before we get to that, can I get you to describe who you are and what it is you do?
Yeah, my name is Marc Steinberg. I'm an associate professor of film studies at Concordia University in Montreal, Canada. And my research has been mostly on Japanese animation and digital culture. I started publishing in the early mid-2000s on what is otaku, and one of my first book was Anime as Media Mix, Franchising Toys and Characters in Japan, which was based on a dissertation that I wrote in the late 2000s. And that sort of summarized that research. And my most recent book is called The Platform Economy, How Japan Transformed the Consumer Internet. And that really shifts to a focus on how platforms are shaping culture today and the sort of economics behind platforms.
Yeah, so what is a media mix?
So the media mix is a Japanese English term for what we call media franchising or transmedia storytelling in North America. Henry Jenkins has called it convergence culture. In Japan in the 1960s, they imported this term, which comes from marketing, called media mixu. And in the 1980s, people who were developing essentially franchising practices around media properties started using the term media mix to define what they're doing. And by the 90s, late 90s, early 2000s, publishers, massive publishers like Kadokawa, would actually use the media mix as a term to brand their products. So it's partly an industry term for franchising, but it's also a general term that, the wider Japanese population would be encountering in bookstores. Like, this book has become a movie or something, so it's become a media mix.
Okay, so how is this different from a franchise?
I see franchise as a meta term. That franchise, we have things like McDonald's, we call them franchises. We have things like Star Wars, call them franchises.
Back to the trash compactor.
Franchise is a large-scale term for talking about something that's produced in a kind of serial way, where there's connections between multiple different things. Media mix is a particular kind of franchise. It doesn't have to be narrative, and I think this is where it differs from terms that are popular in North America, like the transmedia storytelling is a term that Henry Jenkins popularized in the mid-2000s to talk about the Matrix, where you really have to play the video game to get what's going on in the films, and each plays into the other. Whereas media mix never really demanded that you read everything, that you follow the manga, that you watch all of the anime. It allowed people to enter and exit at will. And so it was a more ad hoc and not always narrative-based franchising model. Different again from things like Star Wars. There are things like Gundam, of course, that's very narrative driven. And there are even Haruhi, you could say, is a kind of narratively driven franchise. But then there's things like Hello Kitty, which is also a media mix, but doesn't really require the sort of narrative backbone that other series have, or Pokemon for that matter, where there's a series, there's multiple narratives, but it's about these sort of micro quests. And whether it's a game or it's an anime episode, is somewhat self-contained.
Yeah, so we're obviously talking about anime, so let's talk about Japan. Where did it start? Where did the modern media mix start in Japan?
So my argument in anime's media mix is that it really started in 1960s with the beginning of television animation in Japan. And one of the main figures here is Tezuka Osamu, who is considered sort of the god of manga because of the particular kinds of comic styles he developed. And Tezuka always wanted to make animation, and the manner in which he decided to make animation, and this was going to be the first long form or like the 25-minute a week television series in Japan, was by licensing out the rights to character image to other companies. And so his sponsor was Meiji Seika, which was a chocolate maker, and he licensed the image to toy producers and various other companies. And so essentially, anime, as we know it, starts with Astro Boy in 1963. And Astro Boy starts as a media mix. There is no Astro Boy without the comic. There is no Astro Boy without the toy. There is no Astro Boy without the chocolate. Other animation studios quickly copy him. Toei picks up this same sort of model. And again, tying up with chocolate sponsors. So Meiji Seika's rivals quickly want an anime character to put on their own chocolates. And this becomes the start of a kind of media mix practice that even to this day, people will say, if we don't have the sort of tie-in goods, we just can't make animation in Japan. And there are different models, like at some points, DVD sales or VHS sales are enough to allow animation to exist without the other tie-ins, the other parts of the franchise. But most anime is inseparable from this media mix practice, and that really goes back to the 1963 Astro Boy release. So
it's really fascinating because your book takes a look at two specific cases, and I want to hit on the first one. What is Haruhi Suzumiya? Why is that important? What is it doing?
Anime's media mix is structured in two main parts. The first part, I look at the 1960s, which is where I trace the development of the media mix practice. And the second part really focuses on the company Kadokawa, which is one of the main movers and shakers in the media mix as it's experienced today in Japan and outside it for anyone who's watching, anime and manga. And Haruhi is a kind of transformative moment in the Kadokawa model of the media mix. And in the 1990s or so, there was really a model of the media mix that was based around the production of a world. So like Star Wars was in North America, the idea was if you could create a world, you could create narratives through it. And by following these narratives, they get a wider picture of the worldview. And one of the big producers involved in this idea was now scholar, but also manga scriptwriter, Otsuka Eiji. And his version of the media mix was really about world making. So Haruhi comes along in the early 2000s as a light novel. And I should say Kadokawa is really big in the light novel market. And they put out this novel, Suzumiya Haruhi, and Haruhi changes the way media mix was done. So it goes from a world-based model to a very character-centric model. So in all the Haruhi books, Haruhi or characters from the series are on the cover against a white background, which differed from the practice of the sort of cover illustrations at the time. And the editor of the book essentially said, we're making something like Haruhi-ism. That Haruhi is the center, and also on a narrative level too, Haruhi is the center of the world. And of course, not giving too much away, she's the sort of...
I'll play the bad guy. I'll give it away. Haruhi, it turns out, not only has her head in the clouds and wants to meet aliens, espers, and time travelers, but she quite literally does, since it turns out she's, God. Haruhi comes from that sort of early 2000s Sekai-kei lineage, stories where the fate of the world revolves around the relationship of the main characters, but the Melancholy of Haruhi Suzumiya is really direct about that. The well-being of everybody literally revolves around how Kyon behaves with Haruhi.
我々の恐れていたことがついに始まってしまったわけです。とうとう鈴宮さんは現実世界に愛想を尽かして新しい世界を創造することに決めたようです。つまり世界崩壊の危機ですね。
And by revolving the world not just around her, but setting it through her, it actually shifts the media mix model focus.
So Haruhi transformed the media mix practice from a really world-centered model to a character-centered model, and really became a new model of the media mix that was central to the 2000s. And Haruhi started as light novels, but it quickly turned into an anime series, a second series of which is infamous with the Endless Eight, and movies, manga series, 4-frame, gag manga, and all other kinds of products, including toys, figurines, and everything else that we associate with the media mix. So Haruhi becomes a really important product for this company, Kadokawa, but also a turning point in how media mixes are conceived.
So there's another one I want to talk about. Sorry, I'm getting a phone call here.
Do you usually take phone calls while interviewing people? Something wrong?
Do you happen to know who Lucy Monstone is?
I thought we weren't doing this bit. So MPD Psycho was a manga whose scriptwriter was Otsuka Eiji. So Otsuka was an important person for anime's media mix because he's a theorist of anime and manga. He has a really famous essay called The Narrative Consumption, and I translated that, and I'm also translating, in fact, a longer book on Otsuka, putting together kind of writings of his with Tom Lamar, in fact, from different eras. And MPD Psycho was one of his second major works. And its full title is Multi-Personality Disorder Psycho. It's about a detective who has multiple personalities, changes, and goes through trying to solve these weird cases. It has this really realistic style of drawing as well. It's really interesting. It captivated me, like as a reader of manga. It really captivated me. But I also thought it had this really interesting kind of meta reflection on the media mix itself. So if the media mix is about kind of media franchises, this one was about franchises that didn't fit together. It started as a manga, and then it moved to light novels, and Otsuka wrote a couple of light novels around MPD Psycho. And one of the novels is called Real, the other one is called Fake. And so there were ultimately these two competing universes of MPD Psycho, one which is treated as the real world, one which is treated as a kind of fake or alternative reality. And I became really interested in why Otsuka, who's a theorist of the media mix, right, who is thinking about what worlds do, how he's basically creating two different worlds for this one media mix.
So I realized in the process of editing this video, I never really explained why Haruhi and why MPD Psycho. I mean, like, they're both in anime's media mix, right? But I never really sort of connect them. So let's do that very quickly. When regular folks talk or think about franchises, they often think of franchises as a way to deliver a narrative. For example, you can think of Star Wars and the franchise of Star Wars and the world it has. But that world, that franchise, is supposed to be a delivery vehicle for individual narratives. They're all separate, but they all happen in the world of Star Wars. Both Haruhi and MPD Psycho are doing two particular things. One, they're rejigging some of the ways in which franchises can be considered. For example, with regards to how Haruhi isn't just a character in a franchise world, but she is, quite literally, the world. And two, their franchises are interlocked with their narratives. For both Haruhi and MPD Psycho, it isn't just a situation of these stories are presented in an interesting way, but the numerous ways in which they are presented are integral to what we call narratives. The Haruhi franchise isn't just selling a world that Haruhi happens to be in, it is selling Haruhi. And it grapples with that implication through making Haruhi and the world, on a few levels, the same thing. For instance, visually, this is presented on the novels as Haruhi on a white background. And, you know, there is no world. It's just Haruhi and the other characters on these novels. But when we get into MPD Psycho, it kind of shifts in a really interesting way. Because MPD Psycho, alternatively, is all about the instability of a presumed narrative in the face of franchising. You've got all of these characters constantly switching identities, and, you know, you're trying to figure out what's going on. The manga can seem confusing, right? So what do? Well, you go out and you try and find more information. And then you fall into the rabbit hole. The world of MPD Psycho, its franchise, is just as porous and unstable as the mental state of its characters. And that's the point. Every time you think you've learned something more or something more concrete, the rug is pulled out from under you with a fake world and a real world, and there's no way to tell which is more true. Both Haruhi and MPD Psycho are examples of how franchises and media mixes in general aren't just ways to deliver or navigate narratives, but can be narratives of their own, becoming a sort of media of its own. Practically speaking, this sometimes means that one long-running series supports the monthly publication of a manga magazine. Shonen Ace was doing that for MPD Psycho, for instance. And alternatively, there are actually some very interesting experiential effects with regards to how that shapes the narrative of a particular text.
One of the characters in MPD Psycho is this supposed 1970s musician from the US called Lucy Monostone. And he wrote a biography of Lucy Monostone, who is a fictional character, but this biography made the person seem like it was actually a real person who existed in the world. For me, MPD Psycho is the ultimate in a meta-reflection about the media mix via these kinds of multiple versions, these real and fake realities, and then this strange biography that he wrote that when I first saw the biography, I thought Lucy Monostone might have been a real person, and this was a real biography of Lucy Monostone. In fact, I think it's written under a pseudonym, so it's as if someone else came along and wrote a biography of Lucy Monostone to make it seem like the narrative Otsuka and his manga co-writer were writing were real. And that just, it really captured my attention, grabbed me, and for me is still a fascinating example of a media mix. And so these kind of attempts to play with what our idea of reality is and what's real and what's not through the Lucy Monostone biography, through these real and fake versions of Psycho, through the sort of parallel universes was really fascinating to me. Some of what my work is really about the anime industry, and then some of it, when I do textual analysis, is really about these meta media mixes that make us think about what the media mix is doing or make us think critically about the media mix. And Otsuka has always been one of these people who, when he writes his own fiction, often has this kind of meta reflection about what the media mix is. Probably know this, but the development of the light novel period. Record of a Lodoss War, which is often considered first light novel, started as like a series of role-playing of Dungeons and Dragons, and then is written down as a kind of script, like with just the name of the person, what they say, the name of the other person, what they say, so like almost like a drama, and then is novelized, and that becomes the huge hit that we know Record of the Lodoss War to be, like the moment that tips Kadokawa into becoming a light novel producer.
I think this is an interesting aside, but I guess my question is, why is this important?
I wrote my book as one narrative, the anime's media mix, as one narrative of the media mix, but it is just that, it's one narrative, and I have holes in the book, or there's periods that I don't discuss. Some people say the 1930s is really the start of the media mix. Other people say it's the 1950s. Other people will say the 1970s because their Mazinger Z was huge. And this also is very gendered. So I was talking about Astro Boy, which is aimed at boys. I talked about the sort of Madara of 1990s, Kadokawa media mix, and Haruhi, which all aim for a male audience. And so what kinds of different models of the media mix are particularly aimed at women audience or girl audiences? And there's been some work on this, but I think there could be a lot more interesting work and elaborating on the different models of the media mix, even as a kind of typology. Like in this era, at this moment, there are these different types of media mixes going on. And so I think there's a way that we can start thinking more widely about what the media mix is across different eras and the specificity of practices around anime and its associated media that give us a better model of the media mix itself.
So this is kind of where we're at. Media mixes are an essential part of understanding and interpreting anime. That we often think they're just animated shows, but these animated shows actually have a lineage and ecology of consumption that extends far beyond the screen. So the next time you turn on a show,
Can we
think
stop
about...
there for a second? There's another piece to the puzzle.
Oh, yes. Yes, that's true. Okay, let's talk about the other one. Let's talk about platforms.